I walked into my own home expecting peace, and instead found my wife with my best friend. What happened next wasn't just about revenge, it uncovered secrets that would change my life forever. I never imagined that, at 44, my life would take such a shocking and messy turn. If you had told me a year ago that I'd end up in a situation like this, I would have laughed it off as impossible. But life, as it often does, has a cruel way of catching you off guard. Let me explain. My name's Sam, just an average guy in his mid-40s. Nothing too extraordinary about me, at least not until this whirlwind unfolded. I'd been married to Melissa for 16 years, and for a long time, I thought we were solid. We met in our late 20s, back when I was more optimistic and the gray hairs weren't a concern yet. Melissa was magnetic, she could light up any room and had a way of making people feel seen and valued. I fell for her instantly and considered myself lucky every day she chose me. Our marriage wasn't perfect, what marriage is? But we always managed to find our way back to each other after arguments or rough patches. At least, that's what I believed. And then there was Jason, my closest friend for nearly 2 decades. We met through work, bonded quickly, and remained inseparable ever since. Jason had been through a lot. He lost his wife in a tragic car accident 10 years ago, leaving him to raise his daughter, Emma, alone. It was a tough time for him, and Melissa and I stepped up to support him as much as we could. Melissa, especially, took on a nurturing role with Emma, treating her almost like the child we never had. Emma spent countless hours at our house, practically growing up under our roof. She called me Uncle Sam and confided in me about the usual teenage dilemmas, school, crushes, life drama. It felt natural, like an extension of our family. Jason seemed to appreciate our help. At least, I thought he did. Living close by, he and Emma often dropped by unannounced, and we welcomed them with open arms. They became fixtures in our lives, part of the everyday rhythm of our household. But all that trust, all that familiarity, it eventually unraveled into something I never saw coming. One day, everything came crashing down, and I was left to pick up the shattered pieces of the life I thought I knew. I wasn't even supposed to be home that day. I'd been grinding through another routine shift at work when a sharp, stabbing pain in my stomach hit me out of nowhere. My boss, a decent guy, saw I wasn't doing well and told me to take the rest of the day off. I didn't argue. I figured I'd go home, crawl into bed, and sleep it off. But I never made it to bed. As I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed was Jason's car parked there. At first, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. Jason dropping by unannounced wasn't unusual. He'd often stop over for a drink or to talk shop with me. But something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was intuition or just paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I reached the front door, it was locked. That immediately set off alarm bells. Melissa almost never locked the door during the day, especially if we had company. Our neighborhood was quiet and safe, locking up wasn't a habit for us. Still, there it was, locked tight. I pulled out my keys, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. Then I heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable, the sounds of muffled voices, gasps, and moaning. My heart dropped like a stone. My brain refused to process it. No. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. But it was. I didn't stop to think. My legs carried me upstairs, moving faster than my mind could catch up. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. On the way, I grabbed the bat from the hall closet. I didn't have a plan, I just knew someone was going to answer for this. When I reached the bedroom door, I froze. My hand hovered over the knob, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. It felt like an eternity passed before I finally pushed the door open. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. There was Melissa, my wife of 16 years, straddling Jason, my best friend. They both froze the second they saw me, their faces draining of color. Melissa's mouth fell open, but no words came out. Jason scrambled off the bed like a guilty teenager caught sneaking out past curfew. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The betrayal was written all over their faces. Gripping the bat tightly, I stepped inside the room. Jason looked at me, his wide eyes filled with panic, as I slammed the bat down onto the floor with enough force to crack the wood. He flinched but didn't move. I wasn't aiming for him, not yet. Melissa, ever the master manipulator, finally found her voice. Sam, wait. Don't do anything stupid. Let's talk, please, let's just talk. Talk. After this? The sheer audacity of her words lit a fire in me I couldn't control. I dropped the bat and punched Jason square in the face. Once. Twice. Melissa screamed, pulling at my arms, but I was too far gone to stop. Jason finally croaked out, his voice shaking in desperate, Sam, wait, it's not what it looks like. How long? I growled, my voice trembling with rage. How long has this been going on? Neither of them could answer. They just stood there, pathetic and silent, as my world collapsed around me. I didn't stick around for their pathetic excuses. I couldn't. The sight of them, the betrayal etched into their faces, it was too much. Without a word, I grabbed the bat, turned on my heel, and walked out the front door. But I wasn't done yet. Jason's car sat there in my driveway like a slap in the face, a reminder of everything that had just fallen apart. Fury took over, and before I could stop myself, I smashed the windshield with the bat. Glass shattered, raining down like the pieces of my broken trust. I dented the hood, cracked the headlights, and tore off the side mirrors, each swing of the bat fueled by a single question pounding in my head, how the hell did it come to this? When the rage finally burned itself out, I tossed the bat aside, got into my car, and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to escape. The open road gave me space to breathe, but it wasn't enough. I needed more than distance. I needed something to numb the chaos swirling inside me. A drink, I thought. No, not just one. I needed to get absolutely hammered. I ended up at the bar. The one place that always made sense when nothing else did. Where the world didn't feel so upside down. As I walked in, still gripping the bat like it was a lifeline, the familiar hum of the place greeted me. The regulars were there, nursing their drinks, each lost in their own problems. Their eyes flicked toward me, heavy with curiosity, but I ignored them. I felt like a soldier returning from battle, worn out, raw, and unrecognizable. Without a word, I sank onto a bar stool. Whiskey, I muttered, not bothering to glance up at the bartender. He already knew. Gary. The guy had been there for as long as I could remember. Good guy. Steady as a rock. He'd seen more than his fair share of life's messes behind that counter. Gary didn't pry or judge, he just poured the whiskey and slid the glass across to me. I knocked it back in one gulp, the burn barely registering as it hit my throat. By the time I was on my third glass, Gary leaned in slightly, his brow furrowed in concern. Everything all right, Sam? Not like you to show up here before the sun's down. His voice was calm and steady, like he'd heard 1,000 versions of this story before. But there was something else there, genuine concern. Nobody had ever seen me like this, not in all the years I'd been coming to that bar. I let out a short, bitter laugh. It wasn't really a laugh at all, more like a bark. You ever walk in on your wife sleeping your best friend? Gary's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't look shocked. Just, resigned, like he'd heard it all before. Hell, he said, letting out a low whistle. That's rough. Rough doesn't even begin to cover it, I muttered, swirling the whiskey in my glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. My whole life felt like it was spinning out of control, and this drink? It was the only thing keeping me grounded in the moment. I sat there, staring at the empty glass in front of me like it might hold some kind of answer. Like it could somehow help me make sense of everything. But it didn't. Nothing did. I don't know why I opened up to Gary the way I did. Maybe it was the alcohol loosening my tongue, or maybe I just needed to let it all out before the weight of it crushed me. Whatever the reason, I told him everything. I told him about walking in on them, about the look on their faces, Melissa frozen in shock, Jason scrambling like a cornered rat. I told him about the bat cracking against the floor, about smashing Jason's car, and about the punches that left my knuckles raw and bloodied. I poured out how it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me dangling in a void of betrayal and rage. Gary didn't interrupt. He just listened, his silence steady and grounding, like an anchor in the storm. When I finally finished, he placed a firm hand on my shoulder, the weight of it both comforting and heavy. "That's a bad situation, man," he said, his voice calm. No other way to put it. I nodded, my eyes still fixed on the glass. Bad didn't even come close to describing it. "But listen," Gary said, leaning in a little closer. "The main thing here is not to let them break you. Don't let them win." His words hung in the air, settling over me like a challenge. I looked up at him, feeling the weight of what he was saying. "What would you do if you were me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Gary didn't even pause to think. "Me? Well," he said with a wry grin, "I'd probably start by doing what you're doing now, getting drunk off my ass. Maybe break something. Hell, let's make that official." He grabbed a glass, poured himself a whiskey, and clinked it against mine. "To bad friends and cheating wives." For the first time all day, I felt a flicker of genuine emotion, a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. We downed our drinks in unison, the burn hitting like a cleansing fire. But then Gary set his glass down with a thud, his expression shifting. "If it were me," he continued, his voice lowering, "I'd want revenge. The kind that leaves them with nothing. Take everything from them, your wife, your so-called friend. Make them regret the day they ever crossed you." His words hit me harder than the whiskey. Revenge. It was what I wanted, wasn't it? To make them pay, to tear apart the lies they'd built together, just as they'd destroyed my life. "I'll do it," I said, my voice low but resolute. "I'm going to take them down. Leave them with nothing." Gary gave me a nod of approval, but his gaze softened as he leaned in closer. "Just be smart about it, Sam. You're a good guy. Don't let this turn you into someone you're not." I nodded, but his advice only half registered. My mind was spinning, the alcohol swirling with thoughts of vengeance, of the plans already forming in my head. By the time the hours had slipped away, I was too drunk to think straight, let alone figure out how I'd get home. But one thing was clear, I wouldn't stop until I'd made them feel the same emptiness they'd left me with. I didn't care. I was too lost in my thoughts, caught in the haze of whiskey and seething anger. Gary must have seen it coming before I even knew what I was about to do. As I fumbled in my pocket, reaching for my keys, he snatched them off the counter in one swift motion. "You're not driving anywhere," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Sit your ass back down, Sam. Last thing you need is to add a DUI to this mess." He was right, of course, but I didn't have the energy, or the clarity, to fight him. Instead, I let myself sink into the barstool, staring blankly at the counter, while Gary called me a cab. The ride home was a blur, the passing streetlights flickering like ghosts of memories I didn't want to revisit. When I stumbled through the front door of my house, the place where it had all unraveled, it felt empty. Like a hollow shell of the life I thought I had. I collapsed onto the couch, still fully dressed, and passed out almost instantly. The next morning was brutal. I woke up to the worst hangover of my life, my head pounding like it had been run over by a truck, my mouth as dry as the desert, and every muscle in my body screaming in protest. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the gnawing ache in my chest, the reminder of what had happened, of what I'd lost. It was nearly afternoon by the time I managed to crawl off the couch. I shuffled into the kitchen, desperate for water, when my phone buzzed. It was Rick, an old friend who also happened to be a divorce attorney. I hadn't spoken to him in ages, but I didn't hesitate to pick up. "Sam." Rick's voice was somewhere between surprised and concerned. "What's going on?" "Long story," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "But I need your help." "All right," he said, settling into his lawyerly tone. "Give me the rundown." I didn't hold back. I told him everything: Melissa's betrayal, Jason's role, the years of trust shattered in an instant. I spared no details, because if there was anyone who could help me make sure Melissa didn't walk away with a single thing, it was Rick. When we finally hung up, I felt a tiny sliver of relief. Just a little. That's when I noticed it, Melissa's laptop sitting on the dining room table. Her work laptop. She had a big presentation coming up, something she'd been stressing over for weeks. An idea began to form, sharp and cold. "You want to play dirty, Melissa?" "Fine. Let's play." I opened the laptop and started digging. Her meeting was with executives from a Korean company. A quick Google search turned up some content, subtle, but offensive enough to raise eyebrows if it made its way into her presentation. I carefully inserted it, just a few slides in, where it would go unnoticed until it was too late. Then, for good measure, I added a few inappropriate images, strategically placed toward the middle of the presentation. Nothing obvious at the start, just enough to catch everyone off guard and derail her completely. When I was done, I closed the laptop and left it exactly as I'd found it. The rush of vindication was fleeting, but it was enough to push me through the rest of the day. That evening, Melissa came home. I could hear her heels clicking on the floor, the sound grating on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. She stopped in the living room, arms crossed, her face a mix of defiance and disdain. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold. I didn't even look at her. "Go to hell, Melissa. We're getting a divorce." She didn't flinch. "You're a fool," she spat, narrowing her eyes. "You'll cool down eventually. You always do. This is just another one of your overreactions." I stood up, meeting her glare with one of my own. "We'll see who the fool is," I shot back before heading out to the porch. The house was big enough for both of us, but that night it felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. It was Emma. She was slurring her words, her voice barely audible over the noise in the background. "Uncle Sam," she mumbled. I need a ride." Apparently, she'd been at a party and had too much to drink. She didn't want to call her dad and figured I was the only one she could trust. Even in the chaos of my own life, I couldn't turn her down. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed out. When I pulled up to the address she'd given me, Emma was leaning against a wall, barely able to stand. The smell of alcohol hit me the second I opened the car door. She stumbled toward me, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "Thanks," she muttered, climbing into the car. As I drove, the weight of everything, the betrayal, the anger, the shattered relationships, settled over me like a storm cloud. And yet, through it all, I knew one thing: I wasn't done fighting. I opened the car door for Emma, and she practically fell into the passenger seat, her legs unsteady as she mumbled a slurred "thanks." She was clearly far gone, the smell of alcohol heavy on her. I sighed as I pulled away from the curb, trying to focus on the road ahead while my mind swirled with everything that had happened. Somehow, I found myself talking. Maybe it was to fill the silence, or maybe it was because Emma was one of the few people who might understand in some way. I gave her the short version of what had happened with Melissa and Jason, not the ugly details, just enough for her to get the picture. "Oh, Uncle Sam," she whispered, her voice soft, full of sympathy. She leaned closer, placing a hand on my leg. "I'm so sorry." At first, I thought she was just trying to be comforting, offering some sort of drunken solace. But then her hand didn't stop. It started to move, slowly, deliberately, and I felt my whole body tense. "Emma, stop," I said firmly, taking her hand and moving it away. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But she didn't stop. Her touch returned, more insistent this time, crossing a line I could never uncross. "Emma," I said again, my voice harder this time. But she didn't listen. She leaned closer, her breath warm against my neck, her drunken state pushing her into a place neither of us should go. My mind was screaming at me to stop this, to pull over and end it right there. But before I knew it, I was crossing the line right along with her. When it was over, Emma leaned back in the seat, a messy smile on her face. Her lipstick was smudged, her makeup streaked, but her grin was one of satisfaction. "There's a hotel nearby," she murmured, her voice low and suggestive. "You don't want to go home, and neither do I." I didn't argue. I didn't think. I just drove. We spent the rest of the night in a hotel room, tangled up in a way that defied everything I thought I knew about myself. I was 44, but that night, age didn't seem to matter. Somehow, I kept up, my anger and desperation fueling every reckless decision I made. In the morning, the harsh light of reality hit me like a freight train. Emma woke up first, her grin as wide as it had been the night before. She stretched lazily and reached for her phone. "Let's take a picture," she said, her voice bright and casual, as if this was just another normal morning. I froze, the weight of the previous night crashing down on me all at once. Everything should have felt normal, the sun shining through the curtains, the sounds of the world waking up, but it didn't. The gravity of what we'd done hung in the air like a storm cloud. Emma lit a cigarette and took a long drag, blowing the smoke out in a steady stream. "You know," she said, her tone far too casual for what she was about to say, "you could show that picture to my dad." I stopped mid-step, staring at her in disbelief. "What?" I managed to choke out. She took another drag, glancing at me sideways with a grin that didn't match the seriousness of her words. "Send him the picture. He'll finally get it. Maybe he'll stop trying to control my life." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some impulsive, rebellious move. This was a young woman desperate to escape years of suffocation under her father's thumb. And now, she was willing to use me, use us, to burn it all down. "I'm not going to do that," I said firmly. But the truth was, the thought had already crossed my mind. It would be another way to strike back at Jason, another way to destroy him the way he had destroyed me. The rest of the drive home was silent, but the tension was unbearable. Emma had planted a seed of chaos in my mind, and part of me wanted to let it grow. I wanted to burn every bridge, leave nothing but ashes in my wake. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked as it had the day before, calm, ordinary, unchanged. But inside, I felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right moment to explode. The tension hit me like a wall before I even stepped through the door. Melissa's laptop was still on the dining room table, a quiet reminder of the chaos I had set in motion. She had no idea what awaited her that day, her big presentation, the one she had been obsessing over for weeks, the one that could either skyrocket her career or destroy it. And I had made sure it would be the latter. I heard the front door open and close. Melissa stormed in, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. She was a whirlwind of fury, her face flushed, her eyes wild. I didn't move from my spot on the couch, just watched her with a calmness I didn't truly feel. "You sabotaged my presentation," she screamed, her voice trembling with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I didn't even flinch. Yeah, I said, my tone steady. I know exactly what I've done. Her hands were shaking, and for a second, I thought she might hit me. They fired me, Sam. In front of everyone. Do you even understand what that means? No company is going to touch me now. I'm finished. The words were heavy, loaded with desperation and venom, but they didn't pierce me the way they once might have. Good, I said flatly, meeting her glare. You deserve it. For a moment, she just stood there, her chest heaving, her fists clenched. Then she stormed off, slamming the bedroom door behind her with enough force to make the walls tremble. Just like that, she was gone, for now. But I knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. It wasn't long before the next storm rolled in. I heard Jason's car screech to a halt outside, the tires skidding loudly against the pavement. A second later, the front door flew open, slamming against the wall as he barged inside like a man possessed. His face was twisted with anger, his fists tight at his sides, and his breathing was ragged. What the hell is this, Sam? He yelled, holding up his phone. On the screen was an image of Emma, her face staring back at me. I didn't even bother standing up. I just looked at him, my voice calm and sharp. What do you think it is? That's all it took. Jason lunged at me, his fist connecting with my jaw in a flash of white-hot pain. I staggered back but recovered quickly, swinging back at him with everything I had. We crashed into the coffee table, the wood splintering beneath us as we grappled like wild animals. The living room dissolved into chaos, fists flying, furniture breaking, years of betrayal boiling over into raw violence. When the fight finally ended, we were both sprawled on the floor, panting and bloodied, surrounded by the wreckage of my once orderly home. That's when I heard it, the distant wail of sirens. My stomach dropped. One of the neighbors must have seen us through the window and called the cops. 10 minutes later, the door burst open, and 2 officers stormed in. They separated us, dragging us to our feet while barking orders neither of us could fully process. Jason was still seething, his eyes burning with hatred as he shouted something I couldn't even hear over the ringing in my ears. The officers hauled us outside, shoving us into separate patrol cars. As I sat there, staring out the window, the weight of everything began to settle on me. The house, the marriage, the friendship, it was all gone now, reduced to nothing but broken glass and bloodstains. And somehow, I wasn't even sure if this was the end, or just the beginning. I spent a few hours at the station that night, mostly sitting in silence. Neither Jason nor I pressed charges, we were too worn out, too drained to keep fighting. By the time they let us go, issuing nothing more than a warning, I felt like a shell of myself. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet, the wreckage of our fight still scattered around the living room. It felt like standing in the ashes of a fire, the ruins of a life I no longer recognized. Melissa and I broke up faster than I had anticipated. After everything that had happened, there wasn't much left to salvage. No love. No trust. Just a hollow space where our marriage used to be. It was like watching a building burn to the ground and realizing, halfway through the fire, that there was nothing worth saving. We signed the divorce papers, divided the assets, and went our separate ways without much of a fight. It was over, just like that. A few months later, the house was sold. It had once been everything, a place where memories were made, where I thought I'd spend the rest of my life. Now, it was just a hollow shell, one more thing to leave behind. I didn't care where Melissa went as long as it was far away. That was all I needed, distance. And now I had it. The clean break felt good. No chance of bumping into her at the grocery store or one of the places we used to go. She was gone, and so was the life we built together. I finally had room to start over. Emma, though, surprised me. After everything fell apart, she took control of her life in a way I hadn't expected. She moved out of Jason's house, found a steady job in another city, and began building a life for herself. I was proud of her. She didn't let her past define her, and watching her move forward gave me a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could do the same. Melissa, on the other hand, didn't land on her feet quite as gracefully. The fallout from her botched presentation spread like wildfire. Word traveled fast in her industry, and no one was willing to take a chance on her after that. Getting fired was bad enough, but the rumors about what had happened in that boardroom, about the inappropriate slides, the offensive content, left her blacklisted. She tried to find work, bouncing from one opportunity to the next, but nothing stuck. Companies weren't willing to risk the baggage that came with her name. It wasn't long before things took a steep decline. Melissa and Jason's relationship spiraled into a toxic mess. They both started drinking heavily. Every night became a ritual of drowning their bitterness and failure in alcohol. I guess they thought it might help them forget everything that had gone wrong, but all it did was drag them down further. When you drink to escape your problems, you don't escape. You sink. It didn't take long for their relationship to implode. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that it all came to a head one night during a particularly nasty fight. Worse than anything they'd had before. By then, neither of them had much left, their careers in ruins, their lives unraveling. Looking back, I realized something important. They had destroyed themselves in ways I never could have orchestrated, no matter how much anger or revenge I had felt. And while part of me wanted to revel in their downfall, I also understood that holding on to bitterness would only keep me trapped. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. I couldn't carry all that weight by myself, the anger, the betrayal, the guilt. It was like a poison, eating away at me from the inside, turning me into someone I barely recognized. Eventually, I realized I needed help. Swallowing my pride, I made the decision to see a psychologist. It wasn't easy at first. Sitting there, spilling my guts to someone who didn't know me, who couldn't possibly understand what I'd been through, it felt awkward, even painful. But after a few sessions, something shifted. I started to see the value in it, the way it helped me unpack everything I'd been burying deep down. It was like lifting a weight off my shoulders, one session at a time. The psychologist didn't judge me, didn't tell me what I should or shouldn't have done. They just listened, offering a space where I could finally breathe and let it all out. One night, I ended up back at Gary's bar. The place that had seen me at my lowest. We were sitting there, nursing our drinks, when I told him the whole story, everything. The betrayal, the revenge, even the photo of Jason's daughter. I didn't hold back. When I finished, Gary let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Man," he said, grabbing the bottle and pouring us both a shot of whiskey, "that's one hell of a story." We clinked glasses and drank in silence. Then, to my surprise, we laughed. Not because any of it was funny, it wasn't. None of it ever would be. But sometimes, when life throws everything at you, all you can do is laugh. Because if you don't, the weight of it all will crush you. Looking back on everything, I've wondered more than once if I did the right thing. Was the revenge worth it? Did it fix anything? I don't know. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I just made the mess messier. But in the end, I'm still here. I'm still standing. I'm still moving forward. And that has to count for something, right? So, here's to anyone going through their own battles. Life's a mess. It's complicated, brutal, and unfair. But sometimes, you just have to laugh, pick up the pieces, and keep going. Good luck out there, folks. Months after the dust had seemingly settled, I thought the chaos was behind me. The divorce was finalized, the house sold, and Melissa and Jason's self-destruction had spiraled far beyond anything I could have orchestrated. For the first time in years, I felt like I was beginning to reclaim my life. But life, as I'd learned, has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. It was a cold, rainy evening when the knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I approached cautiously. When I opened it, there stood Jason, soaked from the rain, his face gaunt and shadowed by desperation. He wasn't the same man I had known. His eyes were wild, haunted, and he clutched a worn envelope in his hand. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and strained. Every instinct told me to slam the door in his face, but something in his expression stopped me. Reluctantly, I let him in. He stepped into the entryway, dripping onto the floor, and thrust the envelope toward me. "What's this?" I asked, not reaching for it. "It's everything," he said cryptically. "Proof." I took the envelope and opened it, finding a stack of documents inside. Bank statements. Transactions. And names, dozens of names. It didn't take long to piece together what I was looking at. Jason had been funneling money through a network of offshore accounts, using his business as a front for something far darker. "What the hell is this, Jason?" I demanded, my voice rising. "I had no choice," he said, collapsing into a chair. "It started as a way to make ends meet after I lost everything, but it grew. It got out of control." My blood ran cold as I realized what he was saying. "You were laundering money. For who?" His silence was deafening. "Melissa knew," he finally muttered, his voice breaking. "She was part of it. She helped me." My head spun. The betrayal went deeper than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't just infidelity, this was criminal. "Why are you here, Jason?" I snapped. "Why now?" "Because it's falling apart," he said, burying his face in his hands. "The people I worked with, people you don't mess with, they're coming after me. After her. And if they think you know anything," his voice trailed off. I stared at him, my anger warring with a growing sense of dread. "So what? You're dragging me into this now. I have nothing to do with any of it." "That's the thing, Sam," he said, standing shakily. "They already know who you are. And they're watching." That night, everything changed. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. My mind raced with what Jason had told me. By morning, the reality of my situation had sunk in. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. My safety, my life, was on the line. I knew I couldn't go to the police. If Jason was right, involving the authorities would only paint a target on my back. I had to handle this myself. But I wasn't the same man I'd been before. I'd been through hell, and now I was ready to fight back. Over the next few weeks, I prepared. I dug into Jason's files, piecing together the web of corruption he and Melissa had entangled themselves in. I learned who the key players were, their weaknesses, and most importantly, how to hit them where it hurt. When the time came, I struck hard and fast. A carefully timed leak to a journalist friend brought public scrutiny down on the operation. Financial records I'd uncovered made their way to regulators. And a few well-placed phone calls ensured that Melissa and Jason's names were at the top of every investigation. It wasn't long before the house of cards collapsed. Melissa was arrested first, caught trying to flee the country. Jason followed days later, turning himself in to avoid the wrath of those he'd betrayed. The people they'd worked with? They disappeared into the shadows, no doubt scrambling to cover their tracks. As for me, I walked away unscathed. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure. I'd burned every bridge, yes, but I'd done it on my terms. And as I stood outside my new apartment, watching the sunrise over a city that finally felt full of possibilities, I smiled. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about destruction. It's about surviving, thriving, and leaving your enemies to deal with the chaos they created. I was free.